The concept of 5 times why is pretty simple, but to use the tool effectively in practice, it's pretty hard. So let's go into a couple of lessons from practice and experience into how you can really leverage this tool to find root causes causing your problems. Hello, I'm Tom. Welcome to my channel where we talk about continuous improvement in an industrial setting. And in this video, we'll be talking about a root cause analysis tool called 5 times why. And as many of you will of course know, 5 times why gets its name from asking the question, and why did that happen 5 times? Before we go into how to use the 5 why, let's first go into the whole process of problem solving, and especially there the analysis part, where in a previous video I already explained that you want to start with a fishbone to broaden your scope and to discover multiple probable causes, but then physical causes that lead to your problem. And from that fishbone, which is basically a brainstorm activity, you select the causes that are most likely for this problem at the moment. And for that physical cause, you go down and you really want to understand how could this happen. And then you want to get to the root of that cause. Now, when we check this in our picture, what we see is the fishbone with a problem description, and quite often we use the 4 M's, but you have a number of categories in which you guide your brainstorm for different physical causes of the problem that you have. And if we check what you do with this whole root cause analysis, because afterwards you will select a couple, maybe even one, but from 1 to 3 of these causes, and that will be the first box, the first why of your problem, and then you go on and you ask, and why could this cause happen? There's usually a secondary, often also still physical cause underlying it, but then how did we have and let that happen? And you go on and you go on, and at some point, usually around the 5th time, we get to a point where we say, okay, well, this is the root cause that we can solve to prevent this problem from ever happening again. A good way to think about this is to check basically a piece of ISO, but also a piece of good common thinking about problem solving, and that is that there are different actions that you want to take. There is a direct correction, where you correct the problem itself. There is a corrective action, where you take measures to make sure that this problem will not happen again. And there is preventive action, to also make sure that similar problems do not happen in the future. If we check where do you find them within the framework of root cause analysis, we see that the problem here, that basically brings us to a correction. So understanding the problem that we had, we probably also have a bad batch of products, something like that. We correct it, we make sure it doesn't get to market. That is the correction. The corrective action is making sure that you prevent the causes. So if we have a cause here that will lead to the first step in our 5 times why, this is a very likely candidate for corrective actions, as are secondary or tertiary reasons that we find. So these are also very likely places to find what corrective actions we take, with the difference being here we solve usually something that's more or less physical, but very directly related to our problem. And here we solve an underlying reason to make sure it doesn't happen again. And if we check where can we find preventive actions, well, that is also roughly in this middle part. You can in fact find preventive things, but because quite often this underlying cause will cause both this problem, but perhaps also other problems in similar machines, similar processes. So here we will find a good point for preventive actions, and also, and that of course is where this whole root cause analysis comes from the 5th why. Now, when we look at it from this perspective, we also get a hint at what type of things we are looking at. And that is quite interesting, because if you do a 5 why analysis, I was speaking the whole time about physical stuff, also about the 4 M's. We have our machine, our material, method, and man. Now, method and man are not really physical causes usually, but we put them in there. Basically, this is a direct cause of our problem. And more often than not, they are some problem, right? So somebody messed up and caused a physical problem. What we will be looking at when we get to this roughly fifth why is almost always a process. So you might say it's a method, because our processes are methods. But the main thing is we will be looking until we find something that we as an organization can still influence. And as long as you are still talking about changing gearboxes or making sure that water pipes are checked, we are still more or less in the physical realm. And of course we can influence this, right? We can change our gears, we can change any piping that we need or rubbers. But to make sure that this happens on time, we need a process. So that's what you will almost always see when you go down in the 5 whys, is that somewhere here you really start to talk about processes. So that gives us a good hint when we can stop our 5 why. As I said, it can be 4, it can be 6, it could be 8. Usually when there's only 2 or 3, we are not really down to a root cause yet, or we simply skipped a few steps, but we are looking for a process that we can influence. So there's the other thing, when it goes outside of the boundaries of our factory, so we go to some external, it is going too far, because we can hardly check this. In fact, when we go and put something on a supplier or some external factor, what we should be doing to make an effective countermeasure is to have a process that is designed to check that this does not happen, that there are no problems coming from any external or fixed things. So as soon as your analysis leads you to say, well, there is a law causing us not to do something, and because of that we have a problem, you are not going to change the law. You need to find something else, some other process to make sure that you prevent it inside your own organization. When you say, well, this supplier cannot really be trusted, you either switch suppliers and make a process that choosing suppliers really focuses on these quality parameters, or you make a process to check incoming goods and to make such a good check that you will not get any problems in your own organization. So when we get to the preventive action, these are processes. This first layer, almost always we're talking about physical or a direct relation to the physical problem. Now, another reason why we really like to do a 5 why analysis is all these middle steps, they make us understand our own process a lot better. And when we fix the simple causes, not only do we have a big chance that they are coming back because we haven't fixed the underlying causes, but also when we do the analysis, we can afterwards choose at which level will we put our countermeasures. And this is something that is not often discussed when we're talking about 5 why analysis. People assume that you always want to fix the 5th why. Well, sometimes this is very expensive, very difficult, and requires more resources than your department or your problem-solving team can handle. So by having this logical chain of events, you can pick any step in there and break the problem-causing chain right there. Of course, to move your whole organization to a better level, you will still want to try and push for the process root causes, but at least what you can do is put a good, stable, temporary solution in place. And temporary, especially if it goes somewhere to the 3rd, 4th why, can last for quite some time. It can actually be a pretty cost-effective solution in the midterm. So that is what we are trying to do with a 5 why analysis. Now let's talk about how do we then do the analysis and how do we basically write down the 5 whys. There is a lot of material about this on YouTube, on the rest of the internet, so do also check out different instructions. But the basic thing, and here also it's a nice way to just think about it, is when you go down, you all the time say, it's because something else happened. So why did this happen? Well, because of the next reason, because of the next reason. And a good way to afterwards check if your logical chain is still correct is to then also read it back the other way. And if you read back the other way, what you will say is, this is why that happened. So this is why this happens, and because of it, this happens, which is why this happens, which is why that happens, which is why we have our problem right now. Now, the reason to read this line by line is because when you go down the ladder, it is quite easy to make a couple of jumps because you've already framed your mind in the problem and first causes idea of thinking. But when you go upwards, especially with somebody who has not been a part of the analyzing team, so bring in somebody fresh, and you go upwards, then if you jump over a number of steps, it becomes pretty obvious. So if you say, we don't have a mechanic, and that's why the lights of my car don't work, it is immediately logical that there are some steps in between. So what should the mechanic have done? What is then the reason why the light doesn't work? There are steps in between that need to be inserted there. The reason why it is important to have the steps in a nice logical order is you will use this to communicate with stakeholders. So you are not doing this root cause analysis just because it is nice for you to do. You are serving a part of your organization. You will likely have a whole department, a manager, a team responsible for the performance of the area where you work, and they also need to help you to implement all the actions to make sure it doesn't happen again. So they need to understand what is happening in their own processes, and for that this is a wonderful tool. And if you take them along the logical, because this is why the things happen chain, they can help you to make it better. Maybe you did make a mistake in the logic, but also they will see why putting a new process in place is so important and how it will make sure that the problem is solved. So it is good for your own analysis, but it's also very needed to convince other people and to teach them about their own processes. So to put this all together, when we are doing a 5 why analysis, we are looking for root causes, and we do it for 2 reasons. The most obvious reason is because we want to find a process step, so something we can influence by how we organize our organization that will prevent this problem from occurring again in a stable, sustainable way. The secondary thing, this is also a way to get a lot of process knowledge and to make sure also that we know the chain of events that led up to the problem and that we actually tackle that part which is the most effective way to prevent problems. In your whole analysis, you may in fact find cheaper ways to solve the problem than you originally thought. If we check our whole process in problem solving, as soon as we know the problem, we basically can do the corrections already. So this will happen before we go into the analysis. When we know the basic problems, and they are usually physical in nature, something happened. If you are in services industry, of course, it is service-based type of physical, but in manufacturing, it's usually a product problem with machine problems as the underlying cause. Something mechanical is the direct cause of our problem. So these ones, the corrective actions, they are most often material or machine oriented, sometimes directly into we didn't operate correctly or a person was not trained at all. But when we go to the preventive actions, they are almost always process oriented. They are things, how do we organize ourselves? How do we work? So we're talking about processes, about standard operating procedures, and that's where the bottom part of your 5 why has to go. And preventive actions, almost always a method, problem, something in our processes. Now, I hope that this gave you a bit of a new insight into 5 why, and also you see the technique itself is pretty easy, but there are things, if you know what you are looking for, if you know what the end result of your 5 why analysis should be, I think it is easier to do it correctly, and also as a facilitator of root cause problem solving, it is easier this way to also focus your team on what type of knowledge are we looking for, what type of discoveries do we want to do, and make sure you get to a process thing that you can influence within your resources that will solve your problem. Now, if you like this explanation, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe to my channel if you want a weekly new idea, a weekly update about continuous improvement in an industrial setting. And for now, I wish you the best of luck in solving your problems, but as always, enjoy the journey.